Okay, so my presentation topic was the effect of anti-terror legislation domestically on human rights within the United States. So I was inspired by two pieces of work. There's a piece of artwork by Banksy which depicted a person in a telephone booth who was talking on the phone, but he was being wiretapped and listened in by a bunch of people, shady people in trench coats. And the other one was When Libraries Are Silenced, in which um, during a public speaking venue, it tells the story of a journalist who was, and the library who stood up for his right to free speech, who were both um, arrested by guards for basically like interrupting and making a confrontational question, even though they had the rights to freedom of speech. So those two things interested me because both of those things, uh, it kind of speaks to like we think that we have all of these rights, but maybe they're being infringed upon without us even knowing about it. So when I was researching my question, the first thing I decided to research was, has this happened historically? And the answer is yes, this has happened historically. Um, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War within his Union government with the Corpus Suspension Act, which basically allowed Lincoln to suspend habeas corpus for people that he deemed necessary to suspend it. This included basically politicians who were opposed to the war and wanted peace immediately with the Confederacy. Those were called Copperheads. He actually imprisoned one of the Copperheads without cause, who was a politician, and eventually had him deported after 6 months in prison to Canada. Um, Another thing that I decided to research was the Constitution, whether or not it actually aligns with the Constitution and upholds the Bill of Rights. And anti-terror legislation does not uphold the Constitution in many ways. It breaks the Fourth Amendment in several ways because it allows for the government, the Patriot Act I'm referring to, allows for the government to basically wiretap your calls and collect large amounts of information and of conversations and phone calls from basically you. So that is an infringement because by the Fourth Amendment, the government is not allowed to have searches and collect that type of information without a warrant from a judge. But because of the Patriot Act, certain government agencies can directly tap into that without authorization of a judge. Another thing is that it basically allows for the government to block parts of freedom of speech because since they're allowed to track all of your things and they can detain you and they themselves can suspend habeas corpus, your First Amendment rights to freedom of speech are in jeopardy because they can just imprison you for saying some sort of controversial thing. And it would technically be legal so long as they had probable cause for it and they presented it. Another thing that I researched was ethics. So does anti-war legislation allow for like ethical treatment when it refers to? It's very important for human rights. I found that it didn't. So my example that I found was Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is a Cuban naval base that we use to house prisoners that we have captured from the war. We found, I found that they were not keeping them in very humane conditions. In fact, an FBI investigation found that the prisoners were being kept in very inhumane conditions. Some of them had torn their hair out and nothing was being done about it. Others were basically sleeping in their own urine for a large amount of times, and the temperatures were either very hot, as in the air conditioning was not turned on at all, or very cold, which meant that the prisoners were being kept in extremely inhumane conditions that were often very dirty. The International Red Cross also found that children were being kept there. At least 17 children were being kept there in order for whatever reasons the government wanted them to. Now, these children were under the age of 17, being kept within the same environments as adults, which begs the question, why are we actually doing this? And if we're supposed to be the country that upholds freedom, and we're keeping prisoners of war within this type of area, what kind of country are we? So what I found in conclusion was that while we're trying, in the anti-war terror legislation is trying to keep us safe. It's trying to quicken response to any national security threats, but ultimately, while we're doing that, we're infringing upon human rights in the process, and it's just, it just simply is too many human rights infringement. Too many whatever, we're done.
Well, oh,
Get out!
literally
Get
stomped in
out
the
of the-
background.